everyone can hear me okay. Perfect. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Not recognizing Somaliland's sovereignty is an act of failure by African nations to protect their community and the people of their continent. What do we stand for? First, African states in majority should officially recognize Somaliland as a sovereign nation. We think Somaliland already knows the borders for Somaliland as a region and has been really clear about where it wants its borders to be defined. Second, recognition should be institutional, involving entities like the AU, the East African Community, and other regional bodies like handling economy, security, and diplomacy. Third, we also support global recognition of Somaliland by international communities, such as the UN, World Bank, EU in the long run. 3 arguments. First, on principles. Second, stronger peace and stability. And third, on economic advancement. Argument 1 then. Why is it immoral for African states to sanction Somaliland? 3 layers. First, an understanding to Somaliland's uniqueness is its claim to sovereignty. Let it be clear, panel, Somaliland is not Kashmir, it's not Catalonia, or any other region that is asking for independence. It is a full-fledged country. Why? This is because Somalia actually meets the strictest requirements of statehood. It has a permanent population, a defined territory, a functioning government, which, note, is in fact seen as more democratic than Somalia's. Capacity also, if they have, to conduct international relations with countries like the UK, Ethiopia, Djibouti, officially recognizing its sovereignty. Second, outside of the international legislation to back up claims, Somaliland also has had free and fair referenda that resulted in requests for independence.
Point of information.
Here's the interesting thing, panel. We recognize referenda for independence in other parts of the world, whether it's East Timor in Indonesia, or Bosnia and Yugoslavia, or South Sudan in Sudan. On UAE, we believe the line for whether you recognize the independence of a nation shouldn't come after bloodshed. It shouldn't come only if you think they have oil or economic prospects. Somaliland deserves recognition regardless of the potential benefits to African nations. Second layer on how they sanction Somaliland. Let's be clear, Somaliland is sanctioned. It is not to be talked to as an equal in the international community. It is not to be traded with. Its existence, panel, is not even acknowledged. Its people wake up every day in a world that refuses to see them. Their government remains invisible in the eyes of international law. This isolationist approach is not due to any crime, though, that its people or government leaders have committed. It is punished simply for the crime of having a separate identity and functioning independently. On prop, we do not want to sanction a nation for merely wanting to exist, right? This is neither proportional nor reciprocal. Why is African nations not sanctioning Somaliland important? Respect for sovereignty and non-interference is a cornerstone of the EU's charter. Sanctioning Somaliland is a case of unwarranted isolationism that doesn't recognize sovereignty of a full-fledged nation. Final layer on African nations' complicitness in colonial harms. The African community should recognize Somaliland because it was the government chosen by the people. The denial of these people is an extension of colonialism. Why? First, Somaliland in the past actually self-governed despite being colonized by the British. Second, after the colonizers left, they randomly drew lines on maps and Somaliland fully lost its independence to Somalia. Third, upholding those borders makes African nations complicit in the acts of colonialism. And fourth, even if we ignore the historical injustices facing the people of the nation into borders they do not consent to, is present-day colonialism by Somalia and the African nations who enabled this. At the end of the day, African nations have a principled obligation to recognize Somaliland. I'll take your POI.
After recognizing Somaliland's sovereignty, do you think neighboring countries are likely to treat Somaliland peacefully or with aggression?
We think that violence on the ground in Somaliland is going to get a lot better because African nations have an incentive to intervene and start curbing violence. That is our response to that. Argument 2 then, on why we get peace and stability in the region. Under the status quo, Somalia, Somaliland, and the Horn of Africa has armed conflict, taking the lives of civilians. 3 forms of violence then. First, on terrorism. Groups like Al-Shabaab, right, want to basically overthrow Somaliland, the only strong democracy in the nation. Just last year, we saw terrorist groups like actually set fire to the Waheen market in Somaliland, and that killed hundreds of people and thousands were displaced. Note panel, African states have the incentive to fight terrorists in either side of the world, but it is the capacity to fight terrorists which is different in Somaliland. This is because when you don't recognize the Somaliland government, nations don't have a strong central authority to work with in Somaliland, right? So in Oxworld, they either first pump resources into like an agent to enforce the fight against terror in Somaliland. Second, they either invade with troops, which actually harms civilians like way more. And third, they can either give money to Mogadishu and the central government in Somalia, but they don't have the capacity to enact change because they have antagonized the civilians of Somaliland. Right? Recognizing Somaliland's sovereignty opens doors to means of dealing with terrorist issues. 3 ways on that. First, intelligence sharing. Somaliland can now join into bodies like the AU counterterrorism operation and access strategic resources, right? Second, legal cooperation. Recognition allows Somaliland to enter legal agreements like extradition treaties, critical for bringing criminals who fled from justice. This is crucial for deterrence and extracting that we can save thousands of lives via this. Third, access to financial tools. This is critical. They would be able to work with African banks and freeze assets linked to terrorism and terrorist financing, like the Financial Act Task Force. This is the single biggest impact in this round. We save lives that will be lost daily on opposition side because they do not recognize and work with the Somaliland's government. Second strand then on cross-border violence. Somaliland and Somalia's border tensions are harming both civilians and economies. Regions like Sul and Sanag witness the killing and displacement of local people, but it also disputes cross-border trade, which hurts economic progress. Reasons why this problem exists. First, border ambiguity. Somaliland does not have defined borders right on their side, and that causes a lot of conflict over territorial ownership with Somalia. Formal borders on our side, though, means these ambiguities, and we clearly delineate where sovereignty lies and where sovereignty ends. This decreases terrestrial disagreements. Second, absence of a platform for dialogue. Without formal recognition, resolution of disputes under international law is highly limited. You can't mediate, right, when every conflict is an internal matter of Somalia. So now we have recognition of Somaliland, and we put into any type of aggression under international scrutiny. So any military action taken by Somalia against a recognized state will be seen as a violation of international law, potentially inviting sanctions or even intervention. This acts as a deterrent against aggressive actions and actors. African states recognizing Somaliland is crucial as it leads to regionally accepted borders, mitigating border conflict, and frameworks for cooperation. Lastly, on civil insurgents, the people of Somaliland will never accept a world where their sovereignty is not recognized. This is clear as they face discrimination due to deep cultural divides that won't disappear overnight. They went through the horrific Hargeisa Holocaust, where over 150,000 people died. There is resentment towards the people of Somalia, right? What does this mean? Even if you manage to quell protests now somehow and strengthen the Somaliland government, they are horrified. These horrific experiences are entrenched amongst people of Somaliland, and violence is unlikely to be curbed in the long run. Any solution Team Singapore could offer in the present will not be sufficient or principled to the people of Somaliland. So proud to propose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 14 seconds. Judges, will we now move on to the next speaker?
We thank the first proposition speaker for that fine speech. We now welcome the first opposition speaker.
Today, the people of Somaliland are fortunate to live in one of the most stable polities of the region, with the government chosen through regular, free, and fair elections. But the moment African countries recognize Somaliland's sovereignty, Somalia and Ethiopia will do everything in their power to smother their spark. We sympathize with Somaliland's cause, but recognizing its independence will only hurt Somaliland, the region, and the world. And that is why we must oppose. We believe then that African countries should not recognize Somaliland's sovereignty. We prefer the status quo, where Somaliland is peaceful and not in direct conflict with neighboring nations like Somalia and Ethiopia, but already self-governing. We have 3 arguments from opposition. First, that this is devastating for Somaliland. Secondly, that this erodes regional stability. And thirdly, that this worsens safety. But before that, let's first take a look at the proposition case. Their first argument is a principal one. And the first thing they say is that Somaliland is a fully fledged nation because it has international relations and a stable population. The first thing to note is that it doesn't necessarily fulfill those criteria. In particular, it doesn't have the ability to enter relations within states. They claim they have relations with UK and Djibouti, but that's just not true. It only has several trade officers with select countries. These do not count as formal relations. But secondly, these criteria are prerequisite but insufficient conditions for independence. For instance, New York and London are both cities with strong international presence and with their own population and defined territory. But we don't view them as sovereign states. So even if Somaliland does fulfill these conditions, this does not automatically presume that it should be granted sovereignty. So this is insufficient at best. They next asked, how about East Timor and South Sudan? The problem here is that recognizing these two countries' sovereignty led to huge forms of other violence. Well, after we recognized East Timor's independence, it led to the Patani Malays in Thailand demanding independence as well, leading to bloody civil war. So at the cost of what they want is thousands of other lives. That is why we don't think it's worth it. They then claim the comparative is one where South Somaliland is going to be sanctioned and invisible. This is untrue, because as they themselves concede, currently Somaliland is doing fine. It is relatively peaceful and has its own government that is able to control it. So to that extent, their claim of what Somaliland is like is heavily exaggerated. Before I go on, yes.
Why is formal relations a more important condition than proper statehood, than like a fully functioning government, as you've already proved?
We never said that. What we said is that even if you do fulfill these conditions, it doesn't win you the debate, because those are insufficient to prove that they warrant sovereignty. They next claim that the government is chosen by the people, which is that extent, and if we don't stop them, it's an extension of colonialism. The question here is why the answer to this is sovereignty when you're already relatively autonomous. In particular, Somaliland joining Somalia was mutually agreed and not forced upon them by colonial borders, when they both agreed after colonialism that they wanted to remain within Somalia. So their assertion about colonialism simply isn't true. Their second argument then is that you reduce violence. And the first claim you get is that terrorism happens on our side, while it doesn't on their side because of intelligence sharing. The first thing to know is that that isn't true, because Somaliland for 3 decades has experienced relative stability. So their claim on terrorism happening on Somaliland is very unlikely. But notably, they don't prove why nations have an incentive to care for Somaliland compared to the other nations that are likely to antagonize, like Somalia, like Ethiopia, that probably won't agree to them helping Somaliland. We prove that in our first argument as to why they're unlikely to agree. They next claim that there will be no economic activity on our side of the house because there are no defined borders. But that contradicts their first claim when they say Somaliland does have defined borders. So if it is true that Somaliland does have defined borders, this is out of the debate. The last thing they then claim is that you have a resolution of international disputes. The first thing I want to note is that it's again contingent on other countries willing to help. But notably, they can intervene on our side under our 2P norms. So this isn't exclusive either. So to be very clear, one, that principle is out. But secondly, a lot of the practical claims are outweighed by the numerous harms to people they're going to harm, either that or they're not exclusive. First argument then, on how this is devastating for Somaliland. And the thesis of this argument is that neighboring countries, especially Ethiopia and Somalia, will be antagonistic towards Somaliland. 2 structural reasons. Firstly, neighboring Somalia and Ethiopia have a strong incentive to ensure Somaliland fails when its sovereignty is recognized. Both Somalia and Ethiopia are threatened by numerous secessionist movements. The entire eastern third of Ethiopia is a Somali majority region, where the Ogaden Liberation Front has waged a decades-long violent insurgency, where similarly, Somalia has 3 secessionist regions it wants to keep in the country, including Puntland, which literally borders Somaliland. Because of this, Somali and Ethiopian need a sovereign Somaliland to fail, because it represents a successful independent secessionist Somali majority region, which is exactly what these movements want, making sovereignty the tipping point for why governments will oppress Somaliland to dissuade them. Given that the practical benefits are contingent on countries treating them well, we flip that claim. The second reason is that neighboring Somalia and Ethiopia have the ability to undermine Somaliland. Ethiopia is Eastern Africa's preeminent military power, while Somalia has a network of state-linked militias. What does this mean, given their incentives to undermine Somaliland? On one end of the spectrum, they are likely to cut off vital trade and close essential borders, which is completely illegal in international law. So if they claim they are protected by international law, that does not apply here. Somalia, for instance, will simply let Somali pirates raid ships headed for Hargeisa, or close its borders, blocking crucial remittances to Somaliland, leaving families with no financial lifeline. And similarly, Ethiopia can block Somaliland's Berbera port and starve it of activity. meaning desperate local businesses collapse. But on the extreme end, they can invade Hargeisa and pressure other nations to isolate Somaliland and its people. But crucially, other nations are likely to follow suit. African nations have the same incentives to see Somaliland fail because they have their own secessionist movements to worry about. But even if they wanted to intervene, they've historically been inefficient to act on that aggression, severely underfunding the African standby force and failing to respond to violent conflicts like the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria. So the upshot is that proposition's actions are likely to devastate Somaliland. On the comparative, Somaliland at least maintains current levels of peace on our side of the house. Second argument, that this erodes regional stability. And the premise of this is that proposition increases regional secessionist violence for two reasons. Firstly, more African secessionist movements are emboldened to become more extreme. Recognizing Somaliland's sovereignty signals that if movements reject their home state's authority, they will have a stronger claim to secession, making Somaliland's sovereignty the unique tipping point that fuels destabilizing conflict. But moreover, even on Prop's best case, where Somaliland succeeds, this pushes more people to join because of the potential benefits achieving sovereignty will bring. Secondly, more people are catalyzed to join these movements. A purely negative message about resisting oppression is not enough to persuade everyone, since not everyone suffers in the same way. But a positive message on their side, or what a new sovereign state can bring, is enough to drag many more people on board. The impact of this, then, is radicalized secessionist movements. But even if that's not the case, governments fear them becoming violent, meaning more preemptive crackdowns that unleash conflicts. South Sudan's independence, for instance, emboldened Ambazuni militant groups in the Cameroon, and catalyzing a disastrous military conflict we know as the Anglophone crisis. This pattern continued where East Timor's independence from Indonesia fueled the Patani Malays in Thailand, which took up arms, culminating in failed insurgencies that claimed millions of lives. This is problematic because secession is likely to result in failure, the structural reason being that they go against much larger, powerful states. We saw this happen in Nigeria, for instance, where civil war between the secessionist Niger Delta Avengers and the government created an endless 20-year war. So on their own examples on why it's legitimate, we flip this, because even if it's true that Somaliland is benefited, the number of lives they cause to suffer on their side of the house outweighs that in terms of the numbers. Kwame does claim that more people pursuing sovereignty is good, but that is not true, because specifically, what they do is drive people to prematurely pursue it in a disproportionately violent manner that is likely to fail. What this means is that even if you buy the first argument that Somaliland is protected, they hurt millions of other lives, and on the numbers, we think they lose. Proposition exchanges peace in reality for sovereignty in name, and we will not stand for that, of course.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 18 seconds. Judges, we now move on to the next speaker.
We thank the first opposition speaker. We now welcome the second opposition speaker.
Going to begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, Team Singapore is uncharitable at best and patronizing at worst. There are 3 ways we win this debate. We get the principle, we get economic upliftment, and we get peace and stability in Somaliland. There are 3 points of extraneous rebuttal that I want to give before I present our positive matter. First, on their idea that Somalia and Ethiopia have the incentive or capacity to actually hurt these regions. This is simply not true, panel. Something that they didn't prep for in this prep round is that Somalia gets 22 times more imports from African nations than it does exports. Somalia has exceptionally barren land. It has very few agricultural or natural resources, meaning it is entirely dependent on the nations around it for things like resources. It is entirely dependent on nations around it for things like infrastructure. We think then, to that extent, when these nations we're talking about, African countries, literally give Somaliland sovereignty, it goes against their interest to actually, no thank you, appeal against them. Also then, on capacity, we think Somalia, panel, is one of the poorest countries in the world. They talk about Ethiopia. Ethiopia shares a border with Eritrea. Eritrea is an ally of Somaliland, meaning any conflict that Ethiopia is likely to launch is probably going to get blocked, no thank you, by Eritrea. We think then, how does this weigh with the only incentive they give you throughout not just this first argument, but throughout their case of secessionist movements? I'm going to bring that down in a second, but before I want to point out something exceptionally funny they say about statehood. We tell you there are clear metrics when it comes to statehood. Somaliland has
Point
its
of
own
information.
defined borders. Somalia may contend with these borders, but they know what these borders are. This is why they have a fully fledged democracy. They cannot argue that they get certain benefits or they allow Somaliland to remain a peaceful democracy and a prosperous nation, but at the same time not argue that they don't need the criteria for statehood. We think they do. When we said that they don't, when we said stuff about the UK and Djibouti, we did not say that the UK and Djibouti were allies of Somaliland. We said they were countries that recognize their sovereignty for the same reasons that we do. They strawman this case. Thirdly, then on secessionist movements. This is really cool, brother, because once I bring this down, I bring down all 8 minutes of their speech. All I'm going to tell you is
information.
No. First, that Somaliland is not a secessionist movement. Somaliland is a nation. It is an independent state, and all it's asking for is to be recognized on the global stage. Secondly, even if it is a secessionist movement, they don't prove once why giving it sovereignty is the tipping point for other secessionist movements to evolve. No, thank you. All they do is give you examples of other ones. I'm going to give you some examples as well. Syria and Egypt were a secessionist movement, and they separated as a result of that. For 15 years after, nothing happened in Africa. All the stuff they talk about happens way later. The reason for this is simple. Secessionist movements have different problems. They have different structural barriers to overcome. We are not sure why this is a tipping point. We're telling you that it's probably not, simply because of the fact that most secessionist movements are weak and powerful, whereas Somaliland is strong and has a fully fledged democracy. First, then, on principle, we think we win this completely, no thank you, because they washed it. There are 3 strands. The first strand is that if the 97% of Somaliland in a referendum is coming out and saying that they want a democracy, if they are going as far as to put their poverty in a standstill and still build economic institutions, still build democratic infrastructure, if that's how likely and how much they want it, we're going to give it to them. They don't respond to this. I want to add some weighing here in a second. Why is this choice more important than any pragmatic utility they give you on their set of house? 2 things. First, we think choice leads to utility. Team Singapore is exceptionally patronizing. We think the people of Somaliland, no thank you, have gone through their own version of a Holocaust. The people of Somaliland have gone through the worst forms of discrimination from people in Somalia. We think they know best what is going to help them. We think they know best what is needed for them to come out of this current cycle that they're in. We think choice just leads to utility. Second, we think choice is a prerequisite to utility. Think of it this way, panel. In 1947 India, if the British didn't leave and the British just pumped a lot of money into India instead, that's a great pragmatic outcome. But people in India wouldn't care about that, because to access utility, you need your choices to be respected. To access utility, you need your dignity to be respected. No, thank you. To the extent that they want this enough, that they're going to go all the way to make it happen, we give them this choice because they're not going to be happy otherwise. Second strand then is form of sanctions. We tell you when your passport doesn't mean anything and you have no seat on the table, that strips you of your dignity. That's criminal, because unlike Russia, who we sanction, and even then we sanction whether we argue whether these sanctions are fair, whether it's fair to hurt people on the ground. Somaliland and its people have done nothing wrong. We shouldn't give them an isolationist approach. We shouldn't remove them from the global stage. Secondly then, on conflict. This is again something they just counter-assert, even though we give you multiple reasons. We tell you terrorism, that there's no central agent, there's no way for them to cooperate. They say outside the states don't have an incentive to actually step in. I'm going to rebuild here and tell you why this is most important for other African nations. But because Somaliland, panel, is a place where counter-terrorism measures are almost impossible, no thank you, to take place, it means that terrorism from all over Africa now have a hiding spot. It means that terrorism all over Africa can go there and there's no counter-terrorism measure to actually ensure that they're released. On our side of the house, what happens is this. When you recognize them as sovereign, when you're able to implement measures, other nations in Africa can first arrest these terrorists, and secondly, other nations in Africa, no thank you, can actually ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. They want to close this hub down. Finally then, secondly rather, on cross-border conflict. Their only response to this is, well, they contradict themselves.
Point of information.
No, we think this is simply not true. We don't contradict ourselves, we just say Somaliland has a defined border, we're going with their version of the border. Somalia has some things to contend. We think other nations will come in the way, go for what Somaliland wants, and Somalia won't be able to do anything about it. That then, panel, is how border ambiguity stops. They also ignore the other thing about discourse. This is exceptionally important, and even more so, right? To that extent, the first thing was probably a red herring, simply because when it comes to things like international law, no thank you, if I attack Somaliland as Somalia, it is an internal conflict. When I attack Somaliland as Somalia on our side of the house, it is a violation of international law. Other people are forced to exist. They drop this as well. Don't let them get away with it. I'll take your QI.
Look, even if violence happens, the question is why are they going to prioritize helping Somaliland over Somalia, who many African states is their political and economic ally?
It's not their political and economic ally as much as Somalia relies on those African states. So to the extent that that happens, I'm not sure why that's the case. Lastly then on economic benefits. What's the problem here? We think there's palpable economic struggle in these regions. There's an entirely informal sector. There are scarce jobs, and this is bad also for African nations around them because it means there's very little trade and commerce that actually happens. There are very little exchanges between these countries. How do we change this? 3 ways. First, on bilateral and multilateral agreements. We say 2 things. Recognition is a precursor to trade. They don't have it. And other nations that want to invest can't do that because they don't want to anger other African countries that don't recognize Somaliland. On our side, we have a tipping point. Somaliland has excellent access to the Pearl or Berbera. Africa in regional growth is big, so people want to tap in. We encourage these investors and say the moment you recognize Somaliland, they're not scared anymore and they can do that. Also on private investors, we think private investors are scared to invest in Somaliland, even though there are 2 benefits, not only regional, but also because Somaliland is a very healthy democracy, because policy can be passed in their favor. They're discouraged on their side of the house because there's no legal recognition. There's no stability in payment. They don't know how their money is going to be used, and they're scared of it. You also have better development. You get access to loans and aids that on their side get eaten up by a corrupt government. We are so proud and close.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 17 seconds. Judges, may we now move on to the next speaker.
We thank the second proposition for that time speech. We now welcome the second opposition speaker.
Two issues I want to discuss in this speech. First on Somaliland, second on the region. Let's first talk about Somaliland. The newest analysis that we get in second speaker was a 1-minute argument about how Somaliland can be economically stable. Here are a few responses. 1. Somaliland is completely dependent on Ethiopian imports and exports, which is why there's so much economic activity within its port in the first place. And its main export, in fact, is livestock, which is shipped to neighboring countries like Djibouti and Ethiopia, which we prove are likely to close borders to Somaliland, and therefore they're likely to lose most of their income. But the next thing to note is that the only real source of real economic activity in Somaliland is in the port. But we think port activity is likely to be interrupted for 2 reasons. 1, Ethiopia is likely to just switch to different ports, like ports in Djibouti, like ports in Eritrea. 2, Somalia will not stop its pirates now from targeting ships that are heading towards Somaliland for Somaliland's exports or imports. They might say that the US has an active incentive to prevent this. We say no, the US will only stop this when it's piracy against US ships, not against the Somaliland ships. So that's why on economic stability, it doesn't make sense. But I want to note that they don't properly respond to our first argument about how this hurts Somaliland. The only thing they say is that, Somalia is dependent on other African countries, and other African countries will be upset if Ethiopia and Somalia retaliate against Somaliland. But what our argument proved to you is that all African countries, given that they have secessionist movement within their own countries, have no incentive to see Somaliland succeed. It doesn't matter whether you're Somalia or Ethiopia. If you are in Africa, and if you have a secessionist movement within your nation, you all have incentives to make sure that Somaliland doesn't succeed. That's why this analysis doesn't make sense. But it makes it just a pure lie, right? They say Eritrea is an ally of Somaliland. 1, this is just an assertion and it's not true. But second, even if it is true, we claim that Eritrea is far less powerful than Ethiopia, who is the regional strong horse with at least 300 tanks that it can mobilize at any one point in time. So that's why these 2 responses don't stand. I want to contrast this with their principal claim. They first claim that they meet the conditions for sovereignty. But Isaac told you that these are just, thank you, necessary but not sufficient conditions. But there are more responses to this. Because proposition argues that Somaliland as a state is true by definition. Unfortunately, we are not debating whether this sentence is true, but whether every African nation who has an incentive to see Somaliland fail should say this true sentence if it means that more people are likely to die on their side. So this debate is not definitional, this debate is political. But the next thing to note is that if this entitlement to sovereignty comes at the cost of innocent people's moral entitlement to the right to live, no thank you, we think most individuals are likely to choose to live. They say that Somaliland is currently not acknowledged and it changes on our side. But I would note that most governments are currently already working with Somaliland as a de facto self-governing body within the region. That is already trade with Somaliland, as we see from Djibouti, as we see from Ethiopia. So this is just not true. But then they say you are complicit in colonial harms. This is not colonial because these are post-colonial boundaries that these African countries have agreed to when they signed the African Union. But then they say choice is more important. Actually, it's not even true that the referendum says they want sovereignty, because most of them right now already live pretty okay lives. They have their own currency, they have their own government, and therefore they know that they are leading pretty okay lives. No thank you. Once sovereignty is given, no thank you, it will be taken away from them. That's the first response. But the next thing they say is that choice is a prerequisite to utility. Now I want to note, how many people's choices are you depriving? Because the way here is quite simple. The right to sovereignty is outweighed by people's right to lives and stability. It is true that the lack of sovereignty restricts your freedom. It is equally, if not more true, that the lack of stability and the loss of life restricts your freedom to a greater degree. The ability to access some kind of welfare undergirds our freedom to stay alive, which gives rise to all other freedoms. No, thank you. So on balance, material conditions generally restrict people far more because their effects are felt far more larger. Second issue then, on the region. We gave you a second argument about how this erodes regional stability. The only response that we get to this is that Somaliland is not a secessionist movement. Maybe definitionally it's not true, but in principle, that's what every single other secessionist movement is like to believe. Because you are a country that's independently declaring yourself independent of a current existing state. But then they say sovereignty is not a tipping point. I would observe that for three reasons, this is why sovereignty is a tipping point. One, sovereignty has a profound totemic significance to people independent of the actual effects on the ground. Nations are fundamentally imagined communities. There is no rational reason why you feel a particular attachment to one piece of land over another. So to the people of Somalia, Somaliland's sovereignty represents the ultimate loss of something to them, that the land their ancestors fought for was now given away. That's why there's more incentive for Somalia and for other governments in the region to crack down on these secessionist movements. No thank you. But two, in their best case, if Somaliland achieves the benefits of sovereignty they claim, there is nothing more visceral and persuasive than a fellow movement succeeding in achieving independence, which is why secessionist movements are likely to do the same by carving out a region by force such that they can access a monopoly of force within their region. But third, as Isaac tells you, it far increases their ability to recruit because you now use positive messaging that encourages more people than negative ones that doesn't impact everybody. That's why this is the tipping point. The next argument they give is on terrorism. I would first note that this is simply a lie. You cannot really intervene and give aid to Somaliland if you really want to solve terrorism within these countries. Hold on. All the examples of nations recognizing Somaliland in their setup are already reasons that countries will provide aid. But we also told you that international norms such as the R2P already allow you to intervene, even if they're domestic issues, so that push of international law doesn't make sense. But before I move on, sure.
Who do you hand that aid to in Somaliland?
You already claim that Somaliland has a de facto government that is democratically elected. So we would use that government. The point is, we don't have to recognize sovereignty to be recognizing that a self-governing state. That's the difference, and that's why sovereignty is the tipping point. They claim that there's no defined border, which we point out is in contradiction. But I would note that the main premise of that case really is that that people are likely to stop Somalia and Ethiopia from intervening in Somaliland. Here are a few reasons why it's not true. One, we think the African Union is unlikely to intervene for a few reasons. The AU constitutionally cannot intervene. Article 4F literally prohibits the use of force or threat to use force among member states of the Union. But two, Somalia and Ethiopia can engage in entirely legal actions that the AU cannot intervene in. For example, closing borders or cutting off trade that they cannot intervene. Third, that the AU has no incentive to intervene because border skirmishes and conflicts occur so often in Africa that African countries don't want to intervene in other countries because that sets a precedent for intervention in the future in their own countries when they deal with their own border skirmishes. I'm now going to move on to my second speaker argument on increased terrorism that directly flips that claim. Somalia is unfortunately one of the most fragile and unstable states in the world and the breeding ground for terrorism. Al-Shabaab controls swaths of central and southern Somalia where it generates income through piracy. We think giving Somaliland official independence weakens the federal government and strengthens these terrorist groups for 4 reasons. One, it sends a signal to these organizations that they might succeed should they use force and operate in the region autonomously. Second, you make it much easier for terrorist groups to recruit impoverished civilians to their cause, as they can point to a precedent and say it has succeeded before. But 3, you undermine the Somali government's claims of authority over its own citizens in terrorist-controlled areas, as it is seen to have caved to another secessionist group. Citizens will naturally think that the Somali government will give up on them too. So the terrorists, who have already set up quasi-state structures of taxation and welfare in the areas that they control, now look like the real and legitimate government. But 4, you tell terrorists that the path to independence, just as in Somaliland, runs through excluding the authority of the Somali state by force. This incentivizes them to use more force against Somali citizens and troops. And what this proves is that even if they claim that you cannot intervene in terrorism in Somaliland, which is not true, the main problem of terrorism right now is in Somalia, which they embolden even more on their side. So that's why this flips their claim on terrorism. For all of the above reasons, Proposition trades peace in reality for sovereignty in name opposed.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 12 seconds. We can now move on to the next speaker.
We take the second opposition for that time speech. We now welcome the third opposition. Gabriel.
Can you guys hear me if I speak this? We'll start in 3, 2. The 4 million people in the Azak clan in Somaliland denied autonomy and forced into a nation that cuts them off. For the 4 million people denied an economy and security, opposition turns a blind eye. In our speeches, we have already proven to you 5 different ways in which we get security, 5 different ways in which we get an economy on our side of the house. They just cold drop it in their second opposition. I want to talk about 3 things in this speech actually. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the economy. I'm going to blow up this and explain why it's so important in this debate. Secondly, let's talk about peace and stability. And lastly, I'm going to win on the principle. Before that, I want to make some up-top clarifications. First of all, I want to delete their argument on secessionist movements from this debate. First of all, they don't actually prove to you why it's a tipping point at all. They just simply assert that like different nations in different secessionist movements will see like the African Union recognizing their sovereignty, and therefore they have the incentive to like do the same thing. But note here, not once they give you an actual example of like other secessionist movements that are present. Crucially though, we recognize Somaliland as not actually a secessionist movement, but rather a country within another country that's not actually a country, because of the fact that they're actually a natural country, the fact that they have a full-fledged government, the fact that they actually have bureaucracy, the fact that they have the legislation. The only thing is they don't have sovereign recognition. On our side of the house, we recognize this country in the very least. Other secessionist movements are vastly different from Somaliland. No thank you. Second though, I want to note that the African Union has denied recognizing all other secessionist movements in this debate for the past 20 years. We don't think that this one-off recognition of Somaliland is going to tip that resistance to secessionist movements. Lastly, though, even if you get more secessionist movements, our mechanism as to why that benefits Somaliland still applies here. The fact that you can reduce conflict on our side of the house, at the point at which these secessionist movements actually gain sort of sovereignty. At the point at which, because right now on their side of the house, these secessionist movements are in fact violent, we curb that on proposition. Okay, let's talk about their second speaker argument very quickly now. They say like they will use like force, for example, because like the government is like vulnerable on our side of the house, and that will like give a signal to others to like terrorism. First of all, Somalia is not the root cause of this terrorism. Crucially though, on our side of the house, we solved that problem because now nations can engage directly with Somaliland and not through Somalia. That was a distinction they ignored in their second opposition speech. No thank you. First clash on the economy now. Let's weigh this in the round. Opposition cold drop the importance of the economy in this debate. The fact that we can get investors on our side of the house at the point at which you recognize sovereignty, it like, enables so much investment on our side, so much benefits on our side of the house. O2 says they can just, like, Ethiopia will close their borders. Panel, this is not going to be the case because of the fact that the port of Berbera is vital for the economy of Africa as a whole. Why is this the case? Because Ethiopia cannot close borders because of the fact that the port of Berbera has crucial locations. It's literally on the entrance of the port of Africa, and it's a much cheaper transit hub, no thank you, than the port of Djibouti, for example. On our side of the house, I understand that nations don't want to make that economic trade-off. What this basically, the implication of this basically is that we are far more likely to get that trade, get more investment on our side of the house at a point in which you recognize sovereignty. Understand that delta here, on their side of the house, investments will not come in from like external countries as they will on our side of the house. Very importantly though, I want to actually weigh this in this round. Economic rights and access to no thank you, basic goods is a right to people on the ground. It allows people to do things that prevent future harms. It allows people to do things like have a right to healthcare, for example, have a right to like shelter, for example, on our side of the house. Note secondly though, I think economic development prevents further conflict on our side of the house because they don't want to lose investments on our side of the house. I understand that like the nations themselves, no thank you, don't want to lose money, so they don't want to enter that much conflict because that would mean that they lose out in general because of the fact that investments will not occur if there's mass amounts of conflict. FDI won't occur if there's mass amounts of conflict. We've been clean on that. Lastly though, I want to make it very clear here, there is a very high barrier for war. I am honestly unsure across both of those speeches focusing on war as to why exactly the war is very likely. No thank you. Because of the fact that there is so much investment, there is so much harm that war will actually incur. They don't prove the tipping point in those two speeches of war between nations and nations. But let's talk about peace and stability now, and I'm going to win on like war in general. Before I move on to that clash, sure.
Your case assumes that sovereignty equates to other nations treating you well. That is not true, as we see US equate hostile to one another despite recognizing each other's sovereignty. Why is this a legitimate assumption for your side to make?
Okay, I've already given you analysis as to why the AU, they will not do this. The AU is in a different situation than like other countries in the US. Arjen will weigh this as well in his reply. Second clash then on peace and stability and why we outright win here. I want to note that they say Somaliland is relatively peaceful in two speeches. This is not the case. I want to reject this characterization. When we literally see fire in markets happening in 2023, when we literally see restaurants being bombed by Al-Shabaab in 2022, we think that Somaliland is not a peaceful nation. It is somewhat peaceful in its inter-nation conflict, but in terms of the internal conflict that's present within terrorist groups, that is not the case. No, thank you. Understand that when you are not recognized, you cannot do things like access intelligence sharing. They say, they just counter-assert, you can access things like intelligence sharing. This is not the case because you need sovereign recognition in order to actually get that free flow of information within things. Understand that Himashi gives you analysis as to why we are far more likely to get Somaliland on the table in things like IMF, for example, and like external kinds of in external kinds of negotiations. On their side of the house, they can't do so because Somaliland is considered to be a part of Somalia. Somalia does not do so on their side of the house because Somalia doesn't have that much capacity to do so. As Arjen told you, they are literally a country that is in barren land. They don't have that much capacity, they don't have aid. Opposition 2 says it's about aid that they will get on their side of the house. They will not get aid on their side of the house because they will not get that vast amounts of knowledge sharing we get on our side of the house. Okay, let's move on to thank you, the shocking concession that they make in their opposition 2 speech. They say, and they say you can give to the Somali government on their side of the house. That literally sounds like sovereignty. Because when you can give to the Somali government, you recognize the Somaliland government on our side of the house. We don't actually understand any of that. Let's win now on the principle, and I want to win clean on the principle. They apparently, in their second speech, cold dropped the analysis Marty gives you in her
Point of
first.
information.
We think that it is actually, no thank you, colonial because of the fact that Britain colonized Somaliland and Italy colonized Somalia. Note here, I want to weigh now on utility. They say choice is not a precondition to utility. 3 reasons why choice is a precondition to utility. First of all, I want to note here, you wouldn't commit an immoral action for a utilitarian benefit here, panel. For instance, you wouldn't hang a man to prevent a riot on our side of the house. Understand the importance of this intuition bump. The fact that on their side of the house, they conduct an immoral action and actually remove Somaliland from its recognition that it so deserves in order to quote-unquote get peace that I've already proven they don't get on their side of the house. It means that they lose out heavily on autonomy. Here's the thing, panel. 97% of Somaliland Somaliland people desire the fact that they want autonomy. They have actually gone through referendums and they want autonomy. On their side of the house, they deny this specifically, in the very least, if these people are in a war-torn region where they don't have things like food, where they don't have things like peace. In the very least, on our side of the house, they have choice, they have autonomy. On balance, opposition curbs the economy that they have. They deny Somaliland an economy, they deny Somaliland autonomy, they deny Somaliland security. What they must be denied now is 3 ballots.
Speaker spoken for 8 minutes and 20 seconds. We can now move on to the next one.
We thank you for the proposition speaker for that fine speech. We now welcome you to the opposition.
I want to talk about 2 things in this speech. First, very quickly on the principle that's already out of this debate, and secondly on the practical. First, on the principle, and strangely, I'm going to begin this clash with the weighing. Because that weighing came out in Isaiah, is why our side actually maximizes choice, and they don't actually do anything to respond. They just counter-assert in their third speaker. So I want to respond to those counter-assertions now. To be very clear, what did we tell you in Isaiah? We told you that their claim that choice is equal to utility is just not true. Because it is true that the lack of sovereignty limits choice. It is more true that the lack of welfare and the lack of your life limits your choice more. And the reason why they fundamentally don't respond to is because your life and your welfare gives rise to all your other freedoms. You cannot exercise the right of sovereignty if you don't even have the ability to feed yourself in the first place. So to be clear, they restrict choice more. Their second claim here is just to say, well, the people in India chose sovereignty over utility. But clearly, this is disanalogous, because no one would have attacked India and invaded India and few other secessionist movements if India had become independent. So this rhetoric is misleading. People in Somaliland tend to be misinformed. I'll continue on that later. They didn't claim that choice is a prerequisite to utility, but that assumed, panel, that these choices are utile to begin with. That is not structurally true when we prove to you that the alternative is more likely violence and more likely isolation. That is the reason why that in status quo, many former secessionist movements, such as in the Faroe Island, in Greenland, or in Scotland, actually rejoined their countries and chose not to be independent because they chose choice in a form of welfare. But third of all, they didn't respond to the fact that other innocents in African countries did not consent to the fact that secessionist violence in their countries now become more violent to them. So they don't principally engage with the third-party harm here, and we recognize in the status quo that if there is third-party harm that is not consented to, we would limit choice. So this is the thing of the 97% of people in Somaliland consenting. It's just not responsive to the fact that there's third-party harm, and those people in Africa do not consent. But fourth of all, they don't respond to the fact that the future people of Somaliland cannot opt into this violence. They cannot choose currently to say, well, I prefer the violence to welfare. Given that we don't know what their choices will be, it is only just that we maximize their choice in the future by giving them welfare, by not letting them be born into a state of violence, by protecting their life to begin with. So that statistic on the 97% of Somalilanders agree, even if it were true, is out of this debate, because it is far outweighed by the third-party harm that they cause. But regardless, their principle here is threefold. They first say it meets the requirements of statehood. This is already out. First, we prove that this is not actually true. Second, statehood is a legal concept, but it's entirely a political process. They don't respond to that. The second claim is that we are punishing Somaliland. First of all, this is not true. They do in fact trade with Ethiopia and Djibouti currently. But second of all, this is actually a practical claim disguised as a principal one. I'll flip that in my practical clash. Third of all, they claim on colonialism. Again, these are false claims because they say that African countries are upholding colonial borders and they don't recognize Somaliland's sovereignty. But actually, guys, Somaliland wants to return to its colonial borders. So I'm just not sure why that is true in the first place. But sure, their assumption here is that backward-looking morality is correct. But I want to mitigate that with the 4 pieces away that I already gave to you. So that's out of this debate. They cause more bloodshed and instability that is far worse. And they don't give a response to what a wing that we give you in a second. Second question on the practical. And to be clear, our strategy here was twofold. First of all, we proved to you that elsewhere they cause damage in the form of non-state actors such as terrorism increasing and secessionist movements becoming more and more violent. Second of all, we engaged with the own actor of Somaliland because we told you that actually in Somaliland, their own people are dramatically worsened by the fact that Ethiopia and Somalia are going to turn progressive. Okay, the fundamental assumption under this clash is that countries are going to treat Somaliland well. But just to be clear, I want to separate the concept of sovereignty from actually being treated well. First of all, Singapore recognizes all 193 countries and the UN. That does not mean that we have embassies and trade deals with all of them. Just because you have the ability to set up embassies and set up trade deals doesn't mean that countries will. They don't prove that on their side. Second of all, Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen despite recognizing its sovereignty, right? So clearly, recognizing sovereignty does not guarantee you those benefits. In fact, we tell you to the contrary, 2 structural reasons. One, African countries have an incentive to see Somaliland fail. And second of all, the African Union structurally cannot do anything if Ethiopia and Somalia invades because their constitution prevents them from doing so. No response to those 2 structural reasons. So just to be clear, their claim on the comparative, the IMF and the World Bank supporting Somaliland is out of this debate because they don't prove the incentive to do so. They assert then that the African Union is special without giving us a reason why. Compare this to the 2 structural reasons that we gave, they're out of this debate. Before that, yes.
I'm actually give you analysis of why Somaliland citizens will not accept being part of Somalia because of like the Hargeisa conflict, for example, that came 150,000 lives. Why then, on your side of the house, would you make peace and stability?
We agree perhaps that they may not accept Somalia, but currently they live in a rather peaceful state of self-government where they can pretty much live their own lives rather peacefully and Somalia is not encroaching on their territory. On their side, they enforce their harm. On non-state actors then, first on terrorism, they give you examples of Somaliland being recognized. We told you then we can give them aid. But in third, suddenly they say a concession call. They say, well, if you can give money to Somaliland, surely that means that on our side we are recognizing them. Guys, this is not true. Just because China has some relations with Taiwan in the form of trade does not mean that it recognizes Taiwan's independence. Those are fundamentally 2 very different things. The second claim they make is that terrorists can hide in Somaliland now. First of all, this is not proven. But second of all, many terrorist organizations already have bases in other countries. It is not clear why they will uproot themselves and move. What we told you here was that African countries have no incentive to help Somaliland out. And the first reason is that it comes at a huge opportunity cost to themselves. Many African countries are already struggling. That is money that could be used to feed their own people and gain themselves political support. There's no reason why it will go to someone else. But second of all, this is entirely countered by my second speaker's argument on terrorism, which they do nothing to respond to. So maybe Somaliland has some terrorism now. They far worsen it on their side by fueling terrorist organizations. Our second claim then is on secessionist movements. They say a few things here. First, they say movements have different structural barriers to overcome. But sure, these are barriers to their success, not barriers to them becoming more violent or recruiting people. They didn't falsely claim we didn't prove a tipping point, but in our first speaker, we very clearly did. One, if sovereignty is as good as they say, then yes, it will be the tipping point. Second of all, it's a profound importance. So on their side, they can now recruit even the disillusion that is the tipping point. Third of all, it is deeply unfair to other secessionist movements that all of a sudden another African state is granted independence by fighting using violence. So they will copy that action. They say, well, but Somaliland isn't a secessionist movement. But yes, it is. So let's see. They broke away from the original country, they denied the original state, and they created their own piece of land. I'm sorry guys, that sounds entirely like a secessionist movement to me. They say we don't have any examples of other secessionist movements, and by the way, this all comes out very late in our third speaker, but we gave this to you in our first speaker, Puntland, the Liberation Front, all in Somalia and Ethiopia. So their claim that, well, this is a once-off recognition doesn't stand in this debate, because that's precisely what we're saying. We're suddenly giving them recognition after 20 years that hurts all the other regional movements. The second claim then is on Somaliland and the state actors, and I want to point out they do very little to respond to this. The only response comes to their third argument on economic stability. But we told you that investors have no incentive to invest, and there's no regional stability. So there's a hung claim. And global port may be slightly more expensive, but countries will take that trade-off because you don't want to, for instance, empower more secessionist movements in their own countries. So their weighing then on economic rights being important is out of this debate. We agree. The comparative is that right now, Somaliland is doing pretty okay, and it wasn't that tenfold on their side. So we increase choice, we increase stability, that is our push in this debate. Remember, regardless of whatever rhetoric they want to tell you, they actively worsen the situation that is doing pretty okay now. Proposition trades peace in reality for sovereignty in name. Oppose.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 17 seconds. We now move on to the next speaker.
We thank the third opposition for that speech, and now speaking in replies, we welcome the opposition reply.
Let's take a walk through the two worlds in this debate. Let's start with the world of proposition. Proposition has three miscellaneous claims that amount to a case. One, on the principle. But the problem with the principle on rights is that a right that can never be exercised isn't really a right. Because if I sign a declaration affirming your right to movement, but then push you down the stairs so that you become paralyzed, then you don't really have the right or the freedom to movement. Similarly, if granting Somaliland the right to sovereignty means nobody around it establishes relationships with it, and nobody protects it from neighboring attacks, then they can't exercise their right of sovereignty, so it's not really a right that exists. But the way that we gave you is that this right to sovereignty is outweighed by people's right to their lives, because this is what undergirds your ability to exercise all of these other rights in the first place. Therefore, the claim on choice doesn't really stand, because we proved to you that even if choice was legitimate, it can be restricted when there's third-party harm or you're hurting yourself in the future. We protect the future choices where at least we give you minimum welfare and at least you are still alive because you aren't hurt by regional instability. So that's the weighing on choice. But the second claim they have is on regional stability. We told you why there are incentives not just of Ethiopia, not just of Somalia, but of the entire continent to see you fail. Because every single country has their own bits of secessionist movements that they know will be emboldened if Somaliland succeeds in being successful. What this proves to you is that it's not just these two countries, and they can't claim that these two countries are reliant on the continent. The entire continent is rooting for you to fail. That's why our argument still stands. But it really boiled down to a claim of whether intervention was likely. But we told you that the AU was not going to intervene, not only because it was unconstitutional to use force, but also because every single state in Africa doesn't want to set a precedent for there being future interventions when they themselves try to quell secessionist movements. There's a structural reason that we gave you in second speaker that really wasn't dealt with. But we gave you an argument about how you erode regional stability when you increase regional secessionist violence because they're more emboldened. The only response we get is, why is this the tipping point? Well, we told you very clearly in second speaker for three reasons why this was a tipping point. The first is that sovereignty means a lot to people because it is literally the grounds your ancestors have fought for. No response to this. But second, we also told you that if they achieve all the benefits they claim, then there is nothing more visceral and persuasive than literally an example and precedent set. Also no response to this. We also told you that the positive messaging that you can now use when it comes to establishing sovereignty is also something that is a tipping point. Also no response. They then claim that terrorism is far worse than on our side. But we told you that countries can already intervene in terrorism under R2P norms, but also that you already can send aid, for example, even without recognizing their sovereignty. The last claim they have is on the economy. I would note that there were two parts to this. One part of it was completely dealt with in my speech when they don't respond to the 5 reasons I gave to you as to why economic stability is hard. But second, on investor confidence, this is completely hung on regional stability. Because if Africa as a whole it becomes more unstable, then there's no incentive for investors to go in. That's why this claim is completely out. And now I want to talk about the world of the opposition. And it is true, it isn't a perfect world. Proposition can give you examples about how some violence might exist in these regions, and we don't deny that it is deeply regrettable that some people have been hurt. The problem is that this debate doesn't exist in isolation. They need to deal with the comparative. And insofar as we prove that the comparative is one that's far worse, that there's far more violence, there's more individuals that are likely to die on their side, we think this is a war that is far better on our side, even if it isn't perfect. So let's be clear what our paths to victory really were. We told you that this right, if it couldn't be exercised, wasn't a legitimate right. But second, we also told you that you increased instability on their side, both in Somaliland and the region. But third, and the argument that wasn't responded to, we told you why terrorism is far worse on their side, because you embolden these terrorist groups by setting a precedent for them. For all of the above reasons, Proposition trades peace in reality for sovereignty in name. I'm very happy to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. And then I'll move on to the next.
We thank the opposition sides for that fine speech. To end this debate, we welcome the proposition reply. Thank you.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. When I asked the second speaker how they're going to get aid on their side and who they're going to give it to, they say they're going to give it to the democratic government in Somaliland. So, they are acknowledging that this democratic government exists. They are going there and giving them resources. That means they're acknowledging that they're a nation. That sounds, panel, like sovereignty to me. They might as well walk to our side of the house. We'll give them a nice vegan shawarma. 3 parts to victory then on team proposition. First then, on principle. We think they ignore most of our analysis when it comes to this. They counter-assert the principle. What do we tell you? We tell you, in terms of choice, these people probably know what's truly best for them. This is ignored. Secondly, we say choice is greater than utility because it's a prerequisite. Meaning, unless I feel like I'm respected, I don't care what pragmatic benefit you're giving me. But what do they say to this? They say your right to life and right to stability is more important. Those aren't principles, panel. Those are both pragmatically contingent. To the extent that Ashish Kumar is quite literally associated with Team Singapore, and his workshop is the one that I saw about this. I'm not sure how they don't know what pragmatically contingent means. Second then, on dignity. They say that these lives here are pretty okay because they have their own currency and they have their own passports. Panel, if my currency is not on an exchange rate, if when I leave my city or my country, my currency cannot be used, if my passport is as valuable as this piece of paper because I cannot use it for travel, those things mean nothing. These lives are not pretty okay. Dignity is important. They strip it off them on their side of the house. Third then, on colonialism. This is also entirely dropped throughout their speech. They just talk about our one analysis on how you're upholding colonial conflict. We say denying people's sovereignty is pretty much modern day colonialism. That's something African nations should resent the most, given how much they were plundered by the colonialism. That's something we win on again. Why is this debate winning? 2 things. First, uncertainty. We tell you, panel, on their side, they have to prove huge pragmatic thresholds. Meaning, they have to prove to you why first Somaliland is a secessionist movement, why then this will lead to other secession movements forming, why then this will lead to a lot more conflict than there already exists on our side of the house, and why then they will be able to deal with it better. All we have to prove to you is that these are 3 things that these people want, these are 3 things that these people get, and these are 3 things that aren't pragmatically contingent. Second then, we say that in both sides, we're going to acknowledge that there's some kind of oppression that's probably likely. There's some kind of conflict that's probably likely. We think that in cases where oppression is symmetric, it is the way that you deal with it that matters most. It is your emotional harms that can control whether or not you truly live. We think when you give these people their choice, when you give these people their dignity, when you give them some sense of nationalism in a very nationalist world panel, we think they're likely to deal with oppression better. Second then, on conflict. We give you 3 strands. They only contend with the first on terrorism. They say counter-terrorism also happens on their side because you can give it to the Somaliland government. We say that doesn't happen without sovereignty. And even if it does, you probably don't want Somalia to find out, so it's not going to be a lot of money. To the extent then that you're going to give it to Somalia, we think the Somalia government, being corrupt, is probably going to eat it up, and the Somaliland people, hating Somalian governments, are probably not going to cooperate with them. You only get counterterrorism on our side of the house. They also cold drop everything we give you on cross-border conflicts. They cold drop everything we give you on civil ambiguities, meaning that Somaliland and Somalia hate each other because the Isaaq clan, the major clan in Somaliland, is a minority clan in Somalia. There are heaps and decades of discrimination between them. We give you all of this analysis, they cold drop it. We give you so much in economic harms. We say other countries can invest here. But like private actors can invest here. They drop all of this. Even if they have secessionist movements emerging, even if there's some terrorism on their side, we deal with it better. We give people rights, we give them autonomy. So proud to be one.